Before recorded history, before cities, and even before the first stories were written down, water was already reshaping the world in ways that no human could fully control. Rising seas swallowed entire coastlines. Rivers shifted overnight, erasing land that families had lived on for generations. And in some places, waves and floods arrived so suddenly that survival depended on nothing more than timing and chance. What makes this even more unsettling is that ancient people didn't just experience these floods once. They lived through them repeatedly, across thousands of years, adapting, migrating, rebuilding again and again on landscapes that refused to stay still. Somehow, they endured, and the traces they left behind suggest a story far more complex than simple disaster, a story of resilience under constant environmental pressure that may have shaped the very course of human history. Before we go deeper into this forgotten world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more deep history and ancient mysteries like this to life. Now, let's step back into a world where water was not just part of nature, but one of its most powerful forces of change. The ground does not rise all at once. It happens in slow violence, almost invisible at first, as water begins to occupy spaces that once belonged to silence, soil, and stone. In the dim light of early dawn, a wide river plain that once felt permanent begins to feel uncertain. Channels shift where no one remembers them shifting before. Shorelines soften, then collapse, and somewhere in that slow transformation, entire human lives are forced to move, rebuild, or disappear. Before anything is recorded, before writing, before cities can even define themselves as permanent, water already behaves like a force that refuses stability. In many prehistoric landscapes, especially at the end of the last ice age, meltwater does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as pulses. Massive ice sheets retreat under warming skies, releasing torrents that reshape continents. Sea levels climb not in a straight line, but in surges that can drown coastal plains within generations. For the people living through it, there is no concept of global climate change, only the immediate realization that the world they inherited is no longer holding still. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes these ancient floods so compelling is not only their scale, but their timing. Human societies are beginning to spread across river valleys, coastal shelves, and fertile lowlands precisely during one of the most unstable climatic intervals in Earth's recent history. The end of the Pleistocene is not a gentle transition. It is a chaotic restructuring of oceans, ice sheets, and atmospheric patterns. Some regions become greener, more habitable than ever before. Others are swallowed by water rising faster than forests can migrate or animals can adapt. Along what are now submerged continental shelves, early human groups likely lived in environments that would be unrecognizable today. Coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries. Rivers flowed across exposed plains now hidden beneath the sea. These were not marginal habitats. They were rich zones of life, filled with fish, migratory animals, and plant resources. And yet, they were also the first to vanish when sea levels began their long ascent. In many coastal regions, archaeological evidence is now difficult to access simply because it lies underwater, buried beneath meters of sediment or locked beneath continental shelves. The record is fragmented, but what survives suggests a pattern of repeated disruption. Settlements appear, then disappear beneath rising waters. New settlements form inland, often on higher terraces or foothills. Then the cycle repeats as rivers change course or lakes expand beyond their previous boundaries. The unsettling question that emerges from this pattern is not whether ancient floods occurred, but how often they reshaped human survival itself. No single event explains everything. Instead, there are a long sequence of regional catastrophes, each one capable of destroying local populations or forcing sudden migration. In some cases, these may have been gradual inundations stretching across centuries. In others, they may have been abrupt, triggered by glacial lake outbursts or coastal collapse events that released enormous volumes of water in a matter of days. Geologists studying sediment cores from ancient lake beds and coastal basins often find sharp transitions between layers. Fine, stable deposits suddenly give way to chaotic mixtures of sand, silt, and organic debris. These shifts can mark flooding events so intense that entire landscapes were reconfigured in a single geological moment. While each site tells a local story, together they hint at a broader reality. Early human populations were repeatedly exposed to environmental instability on a scale that demanded constant adaptation. Yet survival was not only about escaping water, it was about remembering it. Even in the absence of writing, oral traditions likely preserved the memory of catastrophic inundations. Stories passed through generations often describe great waters covering the land, entire populations displaced, and fragile new beginnings after destruction. While these narratives later became mythologized, their persistence across unrelated cultures suggests they may encode real environmental memories rather than pure invention. The challenge for modern understanding is separating symbolic storytelling from historical signal. Not every flood myth corresponds to a single geological event, but the recurrence of similar themes across continents raises a possibility that cannot be dismissed. Human memory itself may carry traces of ancient environmental trauma, preserved in narrative form long after the physical landscapes have changed. And yet, even in the face of repeated destruction, humans do not simply vanish. They move. They rebuild. They adapt in ways that are often invisible in the archaeological record. A settlement lost to flooding does not necessarily mean a population ended. It may mean relocation, reorganization, or transformation into a different kind of society entirely. In this sense, survival is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, incremental, and difficult to detect. Still, there are moments in prehistory when the scale of change becomes too large for gradual adaptation. When sea levels rise rapidly enough to drown entire coastal plains, or when river systems shift violently across floodplains, human groups are forced into abrupt migration. These are the moments that likely shaped not only survival strategies, but cultural memory itself. What survives in the record suggests a world in constant negotiation with water. Not a stable environment occasionally interrupted by disaster, but a dynamic system in which water repeatedly redraws the boundaries of human existence. The story of ancient flood survival is therefore not a single narrative of catastrophe, but a long and uneven struggle to remain anchored in landscapes that refuse to stay still. And beneath all of it lies a deeper tension. Every generation that lived through these changes would have understood something fundamental. The ground beneath them was never truly permanent. It only appeared so between one flood and the next. The end of the last ice age does not arrive as a clean break in Earth's history. It unfolds like a long, uneven release of pressure, as vast ice sheets that once locked up enormous volumes of water begin to collapse under shifting orbital cycles and rising global temperatures. What follows is not a single warming event, but a chain reaction that unfolds across thousands of years, reshaping coastlines, river systems, and entire ecological zones. In many regions, the most dramatic transformation is not heat, but water. As glaciers retreat, meltwater pours into oceans already expanding from thermal warming. Sea levels rise steadily, but not gently. The rate fluctuates, with periods of relative stability interrupted by sudden accelerations. For communities living along continental shelves and river deltas, these shifts can feel like the ground is slowly retreating beneath them. Some of the most vulnerable landscapes are also the most attractive to human settlement. Coastal plains offer abundant food resources, fertile soils, and easy access to both land and sea ecosystems. River valleys provide predictable water sources and rich floodplain agriculture. These are precisely the environments where early human populations concentrate, unknowingly placing themselves in the path of long-term environmental instability. Evidence from paleo-environmental studies suggests that between roughly 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically by more than 100 meters in total across the full transition from glacial maximum to interglacial conditions. This was not a uniform process. In certain periods, meltwater pulses caused sea levels to rise several meters within centuries, enough to permanently inundate vast low-lying regions. One of the most discussed mechanisms behind these rapid changes is the collapse of proglacial lakes, massive bodies of meltwater dammed by ice sheets. When these natural barriers failed, enormous volumes of water were suddenly released into oceans and river systems. These events, sometimes referred to as meltwater pulses, could have temporarily disrupted ocean circulation, climate patterns, and coastal stability on a global scale. Yet even these scientific reconstructions only capture part of the human experience. For the people living through these transitions, there was no concept of global sea level rise. There was only the gradual disappearance of familiar land, a shoreline that once sat a day's walk away might shift inland year after year. Fishing grounds could vanish beneath deeper waters. Sacred sites near coastlines could be lost without warning. Inland, the effects were equally disruptive. As meltwater altered river discharge patterns, many river systems became more unpredictable. Some channels widened and slowed, creating new wetlands. Others changed course entirely, abandoning old settlements and carving new paths through the landscape. In floodplain societies, where stability depended on understanding seasonal cycles, these changes would have been deeply disorienting. Archaeological evidence from submerged prehistoric landscapes supports this gradual but relentless transformation. Underwater surveys along continental shelves in regions such as the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, and parts of Southeast Asia have revealed traces of ancient human activity: stone tools, hearth remnants, and patterned sediment disturbances that suggest habitation. These sites now lie beneath meters of water, preserved in conditions that make excavation difficult but not impossible. The existence of these submerged landscapes raises an unsettling implication. Large portions of early human history may now be inaccessible simply because the relevant sites are underwater. What is visible on land today may represent only a fraction of the full geographic range of early human settlement. Entire cultural landscapes could be hidden beneath modern seas, their stories partially erased by rising waters. At the same time, climate instability during this period was not limited to flooding alone. Temperature fluctuations, shifting precipitation patterns, and changing vegetation zones all interacted to create highly dynamic environments. In some regions, previously cold and arid landscapes became greener and more hospitable. In others, productive ecosystems collapsed into drier or wetter extremes. human populations were forced to track these changes continuously, often migrating long distances in relatively short periods. This constant movement may explain one of the most striking patterns in prehistoric archaeology: repeated occupation layers at many sites, separated by periods of abandonment. Communities establish settlements, adapt to local conditions, and then disappear as environmental thresholds are crossed. Later, new groups return to the same regions, sometimes thousands of years later, rebuilding on top of older remains without any memory of those who came before. Within this cycle of occupation and abandonment, water remains the most consistent force of disruption. Not fire, not drought alone, but the slow and sometimes sudden rearrangement of hydrological systems. Lakes expand and contract, rivers migrate across floodplains, coastal boundaries retreat inland. Each change forces human adaptation, not once, but repeatedly across generations. What makes this period particularly significant is that it overlaps with the early development of complex human societies. The transition from mobile hunter-gatherer groups to more sedentary, resource-managed communities is taking place during a time of intense environmental volatility. This means that the foundations of later civilization are being laid in landscapes that are anything but stable. Some scholars suggest that this instability may have actually accelerated innovation. In regions where resources became unpredictable, humans may have developed more flexible survival strategies, including storage techniques, diversified diets, and early forms of landscape management. Water, in particular, becomes both a threat and a resource to be controlled, redirected, and understood. Yet despite these adaptations, no single strategy could fully eliminate vulnerability to large-scale flooding. Even well-organized communities would have been at risk from rare but extreme events. A sudden coastal surge, a catastrophic river avulsion, or a rapid sea level jump could overwhelm even the most resilient systems. The result is a prehistoric world defined not by equilibrium, but by constant adjustment. Human survival is not anchored to stability, but to motion itself, movement across landscapes that are continuously reshaped by water. And in that motion lies a deeper truth. The ancient relationship between humans and floods is not an exception in history, but one of its defining conditions. Long before any written record exists, long before cities define themselves through stone and law, memory is carried only through voice. And in that fragile system of transmission, water becomes one of the most persistent images preserved across generations, not as a single event, but as a recurring force that reshapes the world again and again until it becomes part of how reality itself is understood. Across widely separated cultures, early narratives speak of waters rising beyond their limits, of lands being swallowed, of entire populations forced to rebuild from near total loss. These accounts appear in different forms, shaped by local geography and belief systems. Yet they share a structural similarity that has long intrigued historians and anthropologists. It is not that they describe the same flood, but that they describe the same kind of world, one where water repeatedly overwhelms human boundaries. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is that it exists even in regions that are not directly connected by migration or shared language families. In parts of Mesopotamia, early written traditions later describe catastrophic floods that destroy cities and reset human order. In South Asia, ancient narratives preserve memories of great waters that force survival through preparation and foresight. In the Americas, oral traditions from multiple regions include accounts of rising waters that reshape the land and separate survivors from the past world. The challenge for modern interpretation is not to treat these stories as literal transcripts of geological events, but to recognize that they may encode collective memories of environmental instability. Flooding is one of the most common and universally experienced natural disasters in human history. But during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, its scale and frequency in certain regions may have been far greater than anything observed in recent millennia. Geological evidence supports the possibility that dramatic flooding events did occur in localized but devastating forms. In North America, for example, the repeated breaching of ice-dammed lakes released enormous volumes of water into surrounding landscapes, carving massive flood channels and reshaping entire basins. In Eurasia, melting ice sheets altered river systems on a continental scale, redirecting drainage patterns and creating temporary inland seas. These events would have been visible, immediate and unforgettable for the populations living nearby, but the transformation of these events into narrative memory is not straightforward. Oral traditions compress time, they simplify sequences of events, they transform environmental processes into human-scale stories of survival and loss. A flood that unfolds over generations may become a single catastrophic night in memory. A slow, coastal rise may become a sudden divine judgment. In this transformation, the scientific detail is lost, but the emotional truth remains. At the same time, there is no need to assume a single global flood event to explain these narratives. The Earth during this period is highly dynamic, and multiple regions are experiencing their own localized but severe hydrological disruptions. River systems shift unpredictably, coastal zones retreat, glacial lakes burst, monsoon patterns intensify or weaken in cycles that are still not fully understood, for human societies spread across these environments. Water is not an occasional threat, but a constant variable in survival. One of the most striking aspects of early flood narratives is the repeated emphasis on survival through foresight or preparation. In some traditions, knowledge of coming waters allows a small group to survive while others are lost. In others, survival depends on geographic elevation, chance positioning, or adaptation strategies such as building elevated structures or relocating seasonal camps. These narrative elements may reflect real adaptive behaviors developed over thousands of years of environmental instability. Archaeological patterns support this idea indirectly. In many prehistoric sites, there is evidence of repeated rebuilding after destructive events. Settlement layers show abrupt interruptions followed by reoccupation. In some cases, habitation shifts upward in elevation over time, suggesting a gradual response to recurring flooding risks. These patterns do not indicate a single catastrophic moment, but rather a long-term negotiation with unstable water systems. What survives in both the geological and cultural records is not a singular story, but a layered accumulation of experiences. Flooding becomes a defining environmental condition, not an exception. It shapes how people choose settlement locations, how they organize seasonal movement, and how they interpret the behavior of rivers, lakes, and seas. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Water is not only destructive, it is essential. It sustains crops, enables transportation, and supports ecosystems that humans depend on. This dual nature may explain why it occupies such a powerful symbolic position in early thought. It is both life-giving and life-taking, predictable in cycle yet unpredictable in outcome. Over time, this duality becomes embedded in cultural memory. Water is no longer just a physical phenomenon. It becomes a marker of transformation, a boundary between stability and chaos, between the known world and the world after change. In societies that repeatedly experience flooding, This symbolism is not abstract. It is grounded in lived experience passed down through generations. And yet, despite the persistence of these narratives, the archaeological record remains fragmentary. Many of the landscapes where early flood experiences were most intense are now submerged beneath modern seas. Others have been buried under millennia of sediment. What remains is a partial map, with large gaps that science continues to try to fill. The tension between what is remembered and what can be recovered defines much of our understanding of this period. Memory preserves intensity but loses precision. Geology preserves structure but loses perspective. Between the two lies a complex history of human survival in a world repeatedly reshaped by water. And in that intersection, a deeper realization begins to form for ancient humans. The question was not whether floods would come, but how often they would return, and how much of their world would still remain afterward. Beneath modern landscapes that appear stable and familiar, the earth preserves a quieter record of disruption. Layer by layer, sediment carries the memory of water moving where it was not supposed to move, of floods arriving with enough force to erase soil horizons, scatter organic remains, and reset entire ecological sequences. These traces do not announce themselves loudly. They are subtle, embedded in the structure of the ground itself, waiting to be interpreted. In archaeological excavation, one of the most revealing signs of past flooding is the sudden interruption of occupation layers. A site that shows steady human activity over time may abruptly shift into a chaotic deposit-mixed sediments, water-worn stones, displaced artifacts, and fragments of organic material that appear out of place in their stratigraphic context. This kind of layer suggests not gradual abandonment, but rapid environmental disturbance. Geologists and archaeologists often interpret these deposits as flood horizons, markers of sudden inundation events that overwhelmed local landscapes. In river valleys, especially, these layers can be extensive, stretching across wide regions and indicating that entire floodplains were affected simultaneously. In coastal zones, similar evidence can point to marine incursions or storm-driven surges that pushed seawater inland. What makes these layers particularly important is their consistency across different regions. While not every site shows the same pattern, enough do to suggest that flooding was not an isolated phenomenon in early human environments. Instead, it appears repeatedly in different forms, shaped by local hydrology, but driven by broader climatic instability. One of the most studied contexts for such evidence is along ancient river systems, where early human settlements often concentrated. Rivers provided water, food resources, and transportation routes, but they also carried the risk of seasonal or unpredictable flooding. Over time, many early societies learned to build within floodplains, accepting periodic destruction as part of the environmental cycle that also made agriculture possible. In some cases, sediment layers reveal that floods were not only frequent but occasionally extreme. A single high-energy event can deposit thick layers of sand and gravel over previously stable habitation surfaces, burying structures and artifacts in a geological instant. These events can erase years or even centuries of occupation in a single hydrological episode. Yet interpreting these layers requires caution. Not every sediment disruption is the result of catastrophic flooding. Some may reflect gradual channel migration, seasonal overbank flows, or localized erosion. The challenge lies in distinguishing routine hydrological processes from rare but high-magnitude events. Even so, the cumulative evidence suggests that early human environments were far more dynamic than once assumed. In coastal regions, the story becomes even more complex. Rising sea levels during the post-glacial period gradually inundated vast continental shelves, but the process was not always smooth. Meltwater pulses and regional subsidence could accelerate local flooding, creating conditions where land disappeared in relatively short time frames. Archaeological traces of these landscapes are now submerged, making direct investigation difficult but not impossible. Underwater archaeology has begun to reveal glimpses of these lost environments. Stone tools, hearth remains, and structural patterns have been identified on submerged shelves in several parts of the world. These finds confirm that human populations once occupied areas now far beneath the ocean's surface. The scale of this submerged record remains uncertain, but it is likely significant. What is particularly striking is that these submerged sites often show signs of rapid abandonment or sudden disruption. In some cases, artifact distributions suggest that people left quickly, possibly in response to rising water levels or sudden inundation events. While the exact timing and cause are still debated, the pattern aligns with broader evidence of unstable coastal environments during this period. Far inland, lake systems also provide evidence of abrupt hydrological change. Ancient lake beds preserve alternating layers of calm deposition and chaotic flooding events. In some basins, entire shorelines appear to have shifted multiple times, indicating repeated changes in water level over relatively short geological periods. These fluctuations would have directly affected human groups living nearby, forcing continuous adaptation. One of the most dramatic mechanisms for sudden flooding in these environments is the failure of natural dams. During glacial retreat, ice, moraines, and sediment deposits often blocked meltwater, forming large lakes. When these barriers failed, either gradually or catastrophically, enormous volumes of water were released downstream. Such events could reshape entire river systems and flood vast downstream regions. These processes are well documented in geological records, even if the exact timing and local impact on human populations are still being reconstructed. What is clear is that they had the potential to produce floods of extraordinary magnitude, far beyond typical seasonal variability. Across all these environments, river valleys, coastal plains, lake basins, the recurring theme is instability. Water does not remain confined, it expands, contracts, shifts direction, and occasionally overwhelms the boundaries that humans rely on for settlement. In this context, survival is not simply about enduring a single disaster, but about navigating a landscape where disruption is an inherent feature. It is within this framework that early human resilience becomes more visible. The archaeological record does not only preserve evidence of destruction, but also of recovery. Settlements are rebuilt, sometimes in slightly different locations. Tools and technologies evolve in ways that suggest responses to environmental unpredictability. Over time, human groups become increasingly adept at reading subtle signs in the landscape changes in river behavior, soil moisture, seasonal water patterns. Yet even with this growing adaptation, the scale of some flooding events likely exceeded local capacity to respond. These are the moments that leave the most dramatic signatures in both geological and cultural memory. They are the events that may have contributed to the formation of long-lasting flood narratives, passed down through generations as warnings encoded in story. Still, the record remains incomplete. Much of the most relevant evidence lies underwater or deeply buried, inaccessible to direct observation. What we have is a patchwork of sites, each offering a fragment of a much larger picture, and within that fragmented record, a consistent pattern emerges. Ancient humans lived in constant proximity to water that could, at times, turn from resource into force of erasure. It is this tension between dependence and danger that defines much of early human environmental history. Water is never simply background. It is an active participant in shaping where people live, how they move, and what survives of their presence. And in the silent sediment layers left behind, that participation is still visible, waiting to be read. The great river systems of prehistory do not behave like the stable channels imagined in later agricultural societies. They shift, split, rejoin, and occasionally abandon entire courses with a force that can feel almost deliberate. For the early communities that settled along their banks, these rivers are not fixed features of the landscape. They are living systems, capable of reshaping the ground beneath human feet without warning. In many regions of the ancient world, river valleys become the first true centres of sustained human concentration, not because they are safe, but because they are productive. Floodplains replenish soil fertility through seasonal deposits of silt, creating conditions where early cultivation can emerge. This fertility, however, comes with a hidden cost. The same floods that enrich the soil can also erase settlements in a single season of overflow. Archaeological evidence from early river-based settlements shows a repeated pattern of destruction and rebuilding. Layers of habitation are stacked one above another, separated by thin bands of flood sediment. These sequences reveal societies that do not abandon river valleys despite repeated disruption. Instead, they return, rebuild, and adjust their relationship with water over generations. One of the most studied regions for this pattern is the ancient Near East, where early urban development emerges along river systems that are both life-giving and unstable. Rivers such as the Tigris and Euphrates have long histories of shifting channels and unpredictable flooding. Geological studies indicate that their courses have migrated significantly over time, sometimes altering the distribution of fertile land across wide regions. In such environments, even a modest shift in river behavior can have profound consequences. A channel that moves just a few kilometers can leave entire settlements stranded far from water sources, while simultaneously flooding previously stable areas. For early societies without large-scale engineering infrastructure, these changes are effectively irreversible within a human lifetime. Flood deposits found in some ancient river valley sites suggest that certain events were particularly destructive. Thick layers of alluvial sediment indicate periods when water overflowed its banks with enough force to reshape local topography. In some cases, entire settlements appear to have been buried under meters of silt, preserving artifacts in a sealed environment that only much later becomes accessible through excavation. Yet these same rivers also provide the conditions for continuity. After each flood, the deposited sediment renews agricultural potential. This cycle of destruction and renewal creates a paradox at the heart of early river civilizations. The same processes that threaten survival are also what make sustained human presence possible. Over time, human groups begin to develop strategies to manage this instability. Settlements are often rebuilt on slightly elevated ground or artificial mounds that rise above flood levels. Agricultural practices are adjusted to seasonal cycles, and social organization begins to incorporate knowledge of water behavior. These adaptations do not eliminate risk, but they reduce vulnerability to predictable flooding patterns. However, not all river behavior is predictable. There are moments in the geological record that suggest extreme hydrological events capable of overwhelming even well-adapted systems. Rapid channel avulsion, where a river suddenly changes course, can redirect vast volumes of water across previously dry landscapes. Such events can occur within a single flood season, leaving little time for human response. In addition to river dynamics, broader climatic fluctuations continue to influence water systems during this period. Shifts in precipitation patterns can intensify seasonal floods or prolong dry periods, adding another layer of uncertainty to already unstable environments. For early agricultural societies, this variability can mean the difference between abundance and crisis. Despite these challenges, river valleys remain some of the most densely populated regions in early human history. This persistence suggests that the benefits of these environments outweigh their risks. Access to water, fertile soils, and transportation routes creates opportunities that cannot easily be replicated elsewhere. In this sense, human survival is not achieved by avoiding risk, but by learning to exist within it. Some of the most compelling evidence for this long-term adaptation comes from settlement continuity itself. Sites that are repeatedly destroyed by flooding often show signs of immediate reoccupation. Rather than moving away permanently, communities return to rebuild on or near the same locations. This behavior suggests a deep attachment to place, as well as a practical recognition that the advantages of river proximity outweigh the dangers. At the same time, the archaeological record hints at moments when this balance is disrupted. In certain layers, settlements appear to be abandoned for extended periods following major flood events. These gaps may represent temporary relocation, population dispersal, or more significant social disruption caused by environmental stress. What remains difficult to determine is how these communities interpreted the forces acting upon them. Without written records from the earliest phases, it is unclear whether floods were seen purely as natural cycles, or whether they carried deeper cultural or symbolic meaning. Later traditions often assign agency or intention to such events, but whether this reflects early belief systems or later reinterpretation remains uncertain. What is clear is that rivers are not passive backdrops in the story of early human survival. They are active agents of change, shaping settlement patterns, influencing social organization, and repeatedly testing the limits of adaptation. In their constant movement lies a form of pressure that forces innovation, resilience, and at times, retreat. The story of ancient river civilizations is therefore not simply one of growth and progress. It is also a story of repeated loss, recovery, and reconfiguration. Each generation inherits not only the benefits of fertile land, but also the memory of past floods embedded in the very soil beneath them. And in that soil, the history of survival is written in layers of both continuity and disruption, waiting to be uncovered. Far beyond the familiar river valleys, there are regions where water does not behave according to predictable seasonal rhythm. Instead, it moves in sudden and catastrophic ways, reshaping entire basins in moments that leave almost no time for adaptation. Among the most debated of these events are the large-scale inundations that may have occurred during the final retreat of the Ice Age, when meltwater was trapped behind unstable natural barriers. One of the most discussed hypotheses in this context involves the sudden flooding of a vast basin that once existed where modern seas now lie. In this scenario, rising global sea levels eventually breach a narrow land barrier, allowing ocean water to rush into a lower inland depression. The result is not a gradual filling, but a rapid and forceful transformation of landscape, turning dry land into deep water within a relatively short geological period. Geological studies in several regions have identified features that some researchers interpret as evidence of such rapid marine incursions. Erosion channels carved into bedrock, chaotic sediment deposits, and abrupt transitions between terrestrial and marine layers all suggest that water, in certain cases, entered landscapes with extraordinary speed. However, the exact timing, rate, and impact of these events remain actively debated within the scientific community. What makes these hypotheses particularly significant is not only their scale, but their potential proximity to human populations. During periods of lower sea level, vast areas of continental shelf were exposed and habitable. These regions would have supported ecosystems rich in resources, making them highly attractive to early human groups. If sudden flooding occurred in such areas, entire populations could have been displaced or lost, leaving little trace in the modern archaeological record. One of the most frequently discussed examples is the region surrounding the Black Sea Basin. Some researchers have proposed that rising sea levels in the early Holocene may have caused a rapid influx of Mediterranean waters into a previously isolated freshwater lake system. While the magnitude and speed of this event remain controversial, sedimentary evidence does show a significant transition from freshwater to marine conditions at a relatively sharp boundary in geological time. If even partially accurate, such an event would have had profound implications for human populations living along the basin's former shores. Coastal settlements would have been inundated, forcing rapid migration inland. River systems feeding into the basin would have been affected by changing water levels and salinity, disrupting ecological balance across a wide area. Yet it is important to emphasize that these interpretations are not universally accepted. Some geologists argue that the transition may have been more gradual, occurring over centuries rather than days or months. The evidence, while suggestive of change, does not definitively prove a single catastrophic flood event. This uncertainty is central to ongoing research. Beyond this specific case, similar debates exist for other regions where rapid hydrological change is suspected. Glacial lake outburst floods in North America, for example, demonstrate that ice-dammed lakes can release enormous volumes of water suddenly, carving deep channels and reshaping entire landscapes. These events are well documented and provide a clear mechanism for large-scale flooding, independent of marine transgressions. In all these cases, the underlying principle is the same: water stored in unstable natural reservoirs can be released with little warning when structural thresholds are crossed. Ice dams fail, sediment barriers collapse, coastal thresholds are breached. When this happens, the resulting floods are not merely large, they are transformative, capable of altering geography on a continental scale. For any human populations living within these zones, the consequences would be immediate and severe. Unlike seasonal flooding, which can be anticipated and adapted to, these events occur outside the range of normal environmental expectation. There is no gradual adjustment period. Survival depends on proximity, elevation, and chance positioning within the landscape. Archaeological visibility of such events is limited. Rapid floods can destroy settlements while also erasing much of the evidence of their existence. Coastal and low-lying sites affected by such inundations are often submerged or deeply buried, making direct investigation difficult. In many cases, only indirect geological markers remain. Despite these limitations, the possibility of sudden large-scale flooding adds another dimension to the story of early human survival. It suggests that alongside slow environmental change, there were also rare but extreme events capable of resetting entire regions. These events would not have been common, but their impact would have been disproportionate. In oral traditions and later mythologies, such rare catastrophes may have left disproportionately strong impressions. A single generational memory of sudden inundation could evolve into enduring narratives of great floods that reshape the world. While such stories cannot be directly mapped onto specific geological events, they may reflect the psychological imprint of extreme environmental disruption. What emerges from this combination of evidence and interpretation is a layered picture of ancient water dynamics. Some floods are slow and cyclical, tied to seasonal or climatic rhythms. Others are sudden and catastrophic, driven by structural failures in natural reservoirs. Early human populations likely experience both types, often within the same broad environmental framework. The challenge for modern understanding is not to identify a single universal flood event, but to recognize the diversity of hydrological processes that shaped prehistoric landscapes. Water does not act in one way. It moves through systems of stability and instability, sometimes predictable, sometimes violently abrupt. And within that variability lies the deeper story of human survival, a continuous negotiation with a force that can both sustain and erase life, depending entirely on how and when it moves. In the highlands and elevated plateaus beyond the reach of most seasonal floods, early human groups discover something that feels almost like safety, though it is never absolute. Height offers protection from the most immediate threats of rising water, but it also introduces new constraints. Soil is thinner, resources are more scattered, and the environment is often harsher than the fertile lowlands below. Still, when the rivers below become unpredictable, elevation becomes the most reliable form of refuge. Archaeological patterns suggest that during periods of increased flooding in river valleys and coastal plains, human settlement gradually shifts toward higher terrain. This is not a single coordinated migration, but a repeated pattern across different regions and time periods. Groups move upslope, establish temporary or semi-permanent camps, and sometimes remain there long enough for cultural adaptation to take root. These upland zones are not empty landscapes. They are often already occupied by wildlife, seasonal vegetation cycles, and in some cases, earlier human groups adapted to non-riverine environments. The interaction between incoming populations and existing ecological systems creates new forms of subsistence strategy, often combining hunting, foraging, and limited plant cultivation adapted to marginal soils. One of the most significant consequences of this shift is the change in how humans perceive environmental stability. In river valleys, stability is tied to predictable seasonal cycles. In uplands, stability is more fragmented, dependent on localized rainfall patterns, seasonal migration of animals, and microclimates shaped by elevation and terrain. This creates a different relationship with uncertainty, less about sudden inundation and more about scarcity and variability. However, the move to higher ground does not eliminate exposure to flood-related disruption. Many upland regions are connected to downstream systems through rivers, which means that changes below can still affect conditions above. Flooding in valleys can alter sediment transport, water availability, and even climate conditions in surrounding areas. In some cases, extreme events can trigger landslides or slope instability in upland regions, creating secondary hazards that are indirectly linked to hydrological change. Evidence from settlement archaeology shows that some upland sites are occupied repeatedly over long periods, suggesting that these regions serve as long-term refuges during times of environmental stress. Layers of habitation in caves, rock shelters, and terrace sites indicate cycles of occupation and abandonment that often correspond with broader climatic fluctuations. In certain cases, these upland refuges may have played a crucial role in population continuity. When lowland environments became temporarily uninhabitable due to flooding or ecological disruption, upland groups could maintain genetic and cultural continuity until conditions stabilized. This dynamic may help explain how human populations persist through repeated environmental crises without complete collapse. Yet life in these regions is not simply a passive response to danger. Over time, upland communities develop distinct cultural and technological adaptations. Toolkits shift to reflect different resource availability. Mobility patterns adjust to terrain constraints. Social networks may expand to connect dispersed groups across fragmented landscapes. In this way, environmental pressure does not only force movement, it also shapes innovation. At the same time, the memory of lowland abundance does not disappear. Oral traditions in many regions preserve references to fertile plains, abundant water sources, and landscapes that later become associated with loss or displacement. Whether these memories are direct recollections or inherited narratives is difficult to determine, but they suggest a persistent awareness of environmental change across generations. One of the most important aspects of this upland transition is that it does not represent a permanent abandonment of flood-prone regions. Instead, it is often cyclical. As conditions stabilize, populations return to river valleys and coastal zones. When instability increases again, movement reverses. Human settlement patterns during this period are therefore best understood as fluid rather than fixed, responding continuously to environmental signals. This oscillation between lowlands and uplands creates a dynamic population structure. Communities are not anchored to a single ecological zone but distributed across multiple environments, each serving different roles in survival strategies. Lowlands offer productivity and connectivity. Uplands offer security and continuity. Together, they form a flexible system of occupation shaped by water's unpredictability. In some regions, this dual settlement pattern may have influenced early social organization. Groups maintaining seasonal or periodic movement between ecological zones would require knowledge exchange, coordination, and shared memory of landscape behavior. Over time, this could contribute to increasingly complex social structures capable of managing environmental uncertainty. Still, the fundamental driver of this movement remains water. Even in upland regions, the influence of flooding is never entirely absent. It shapes the timing of migration, the selection of settlement sites, and the long-term distribution of populations across landscapes. In this sense, elevation is not an escape from water, but a repositioning within its broader influence. What emerges from the archaeological record is a picture of human survival, defined not by stability, but by responsiveness. Early populations do not resist environmental change so much as they track it, adjusting their position in space and time to match shifting conditions. This adaptability becomes one of the defining features of human resilience. And beneath this pattern lies a quiet recognition embedded in both behavior and memory when water becomes unpredictable below. Survival depends on knowing when to rise above it and when to return. Along the great river corridors of prehistory, life persists not in spite of flooding, but inside its rhythm. These are landscapes where water does not merely disrupt settlement, it defines it, every year, sometimes every season. The land breathes through cycles of overflow and retreat, deposition and erosion, creation and loss. For early human groups, living in these environments requires a form of attentiveness that goes beyond simple observation. River behavior must be read like a language. Subtle changes in current speed, sediment color, bank erosion, and vegetation patterns become signals that determine when to move, when to plant, and when to retreat. Over generations, this knowledge becomes embedded in collective experience rather than formal instruction. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest sustained agricultural systems emerge directly within these unstable floodplain environments. The reason is deceptively simple. Floodwaters, while destructive in the short term, deliver nutrient-rich sediments that renew soil fertility. In a sense, The river acts as both destroyer and cultivator, repeatedly resetting the conditions for plant growth. However, this balance is fragile. A flood that is slightly too high or slightly too prolonged can erase an entire season of labor. Conversely, a year without sufficient flooding can lead to soil depletion and reduced yields. Survival in such systems depends on understanding variability rather than expecting consistency. Over time, some communities begin to develop more structured responses to this variability. Settlement placement becomes more strategic, often favoring slightly elevated zones within floodplains. Agricultural fields are diversified across different microenvironments to spread risk. Storage practices emerge to buffer against years of loss. These developments do not eliminate uncertainty, but they reduce its most catastrophic effects. Still, the river remains unpredictable in ways that cannot be fully controlled. Geological records show that flood regimes can shift dramatically due to upstream changes, climatic fluctuations, or sudden channel migration. A river that behaves relatively predictably for decades can suddenly enter a phase of instability, producing floods of unexpected magnitude or duration. In some cases, entire settlement sequences appear to be interrupted by such shifts. Archaeological layers reveal abrupt abandonment followed by reoccupation centuries later. This pattern suggests that some riverine regions undergo cycles of habitability and disruption that exceed normal generational memory. Beyond the physical impact, these cycles likely shape cultural perception of time itself. In environments where destruction and renewal are routine, history is not linear. It is cyclical, marked by recurring phases of loss and rebuilding. This worldview may be reflected in later traditions that emphasize cycles of destruction and renewal in both nature and human society. Yet even within this cyclical framework, certain events stand out as exceptional. Geological evidence sometimes points to flood episodes of extraordinary magnitude, where water levels rise far beyond typical seasonal boundaries. These events can deposit thick layers of sediment across wide areas, burying landscapes in a single hydrological episode. Such extreme floods are not easily integrated into normal adaptive strategies. While communities may be prepared for annual inundation, they're not necessarily equipped for rare, high-magnitude events that exceed all previous experience. It is in these moments that survival depends less on planning and more on chance, geography, and rapid response. The archaeological record preserves indirect traces of these disruptions. In some regions, settlements appear to be sealed beneath sudden sediment layers, preserving structures and artifacts in a snapshot of abandonment. These sites offer rare glimpses into moments when water overwhelmed human presence faster than it could be evacuated or adapted to. At the same time, not all flood impacts are destructive in the same way. Some events redistribute populations without erasing them. Communities displaced from one area may establish new settlements downstream or on higher ground, carrying with them knowledge, tools, and cultural practices shaped by their previous environment. In this way, flooding can act as a mechanism of dispersion as well as destruction. This dual effect, both destructive and generative, adds complexity to the role of rivers in early human development. Water is not simply an external force acting on passive societies. It is part of a dynamic system in which human adaptation and environmental change are deeply intertwined. Over long periods, this relationship produces a kind of co-evolution between humans and floodplain environments. Settlement strategies, tool technologies, and social organization gradually reflect the need to anticipate and respond to hydrological variability. Even agricultural systems are shaped by the timing and intensity of floods. Yet despite this adaptation, uncertainty remains a constant presence. No system of knowledge or practice can fully eliminate the risk of extreme events. This persistent uncertainty becomes a defining feature of life in riverine environments, shaping not only survival strategies but also broader cultural attitudes toward nature. What emerges from this long interaction is not control over water, but familiarity with its unpredictability. Early humans do not master the river. They learn to live alongside its instability, accepting that stability itself is temporary. And in that acceptance lies one of the most important patterns of prehistoric survival resilience is not the absence of disruption, but the ability to remain within its ongoing flow. At a certain point in prehistory, water stops being only a force of seasonal rhythm or environmental instability and becomes something more transformative, a medium of movement, not just a boundary to be avoided or endured, but a pathway that connects distant landscapes. This shift marks one of the most subtle yet profound changes in human survival strategy. The earliest watercraft leave almost no direct archaeological trace. They are built from organic materials, wood, reeds, animal hides, materials that rarely survive long enough to enter the geological record. Yet indirect evidence strongly suggests that by the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, humans are already capable of crossing rivers, lakes, and even short sea distances using simple but effective flotation technologies. This development is not sudden. It emerges gradually from necessity, in landscapes fragmented by flooding, shifting rivers, and rising seas. Terrestrial routes are no longer reliable. Channels that once could be forded become too deep or too wide. Coastal plains fragment into wetlands and islands. In such conditions, water becomes not only an obstacle, but a more efficient route than land. Archaeological patterns support this gradual expansion of aquatic mobility. Human presence on islands separated from continental landmasses suggest crossings that could only have been achieved by water. Some of these occupations date to periods when sea levels were lower than today, reducing distances but still requiring deliberate seafaring, or at least coastal navigation. Even modest crossings imply planning, coordination, and knowledge of currents and weather. In riverine and lacustrine environments, watercraft would have offered significant advantages. Transporting goods, moving between seasonal camps, and accessing dispersed resources become far more efficient when water is used as a route rather than an obstacle. Over time, this likely contributes to increasingly complex networks of movement across aquatic landscapes. Yet the same waters that enable movement are also those responsible for destruction. Early navigation occurs within environments that are still highly unstable. Rising sea levels continue to reshape coastlines. Rivers shift unpredictably. Storm systems and seasonal floods create dangerous conditions for even short-distance travel. The early development of watercraft is therefore inseparable from risk. In some regions, evidence suggests that human groups respond to flooding by increasing their use of aquatic routes rather than avoiding them. As lowland areas become more fragmented by water, mobility across channels and wetlands becomes essential for survival. This creates a feedback loop in which environmental instability accelerates technological adaptation. One of the most important consequences of early water travel is the expansion of human connectivity. Regions that were once separated by difficult terrain or seasonal barriers become linked through navigable waterways. Cultural exchange, resource sharing, and population movement all become easier, even in unstable environmental conditions. Water, in this sense, becomes both the source of disruption and the medium through which adaptation spreads. At the same time, coastal environments begin to take on a new significance. They are no longer simply margins between land and sea. but active zones of human occupation and movement, estuaries, deltas, and sheltered bays offer rich ecosystems and navigational advantages. However, they are also among the most vulnerable areas to sea level rise and storm-driven flooding. Evidence from submerged prehistoric sites indicates that some of these coastal zones were once heavily inhabited. Stone tools, shell middens, and structural remnants suggest sustained human presence in areas that are now underwater. These findings reinforce the idea that early human populations were not marginal users of coastal environments, but deeply integrated into them. The loss of these landscapes beneath rising seas represents one of the most significant gaps in the archaeological record. Entire cultural zones may now lie inaccessible on continental shelves, their histories partially erased by post-glacial inundation. What remains on land may represent only inland fragments of broader coastal systems. Despite these losses, the emergence of aquatic mobility marks a turning point in human resilience. It allows populations to respond to flooding not only by retreating inland or upward, but by moving laterally across water networks. This flexibility reduces the isolation of communities and increases the potential for recovery after environmental disruption. However, water travel does not eliminate vulnerability. It introduces new forms of risk, including exposure to storms, currents, and navigation errors. Survival now depends not only on understanding land-based environmental cues, but also on reading water behavior wave patterns, wind direction, and seasonal changes in aquatic conditions. Over time, this dual awareness of land and water environments becomes a defining feature of human adaptation. Early societies are no longer purely terrestrial. They exist within a hybrid landscape where movement across water is as important as movement across land. And within this expanded world, flooding takes on a new meaning. It is no longer only an event that displaces populations. It is also a force that reshapes routes, opens new connections, and continuously redraws the map of human possibility. In certain moments of prehistory, water does not arrive as a slow expansion or seasonal disruption, but as a wall of motion moving across the landscape with overwhelming force. These are the rarest and most violent expressions of hydrological change, where entire coastlines or valleys are reshaped not over centuries, but in a single catastrophic sequence of energy release. One of the primary drivers of such events is not rainfall or seasonal flooding, but mass instability within the Earth's own geological and cryospheric systems. When large bodies of sediment or ice lose structural integrity, they can collapse suddenly, releasing enormous volumes of trapped water. In other cases, underwater slope failures can displace entire columns of seawater, generating waves that propagate across long distances with devastating impact. These processes are well understood in principle through modern geology, but their prehistoric counterparts are more difficult to reconstruct. The evidence is often fragmented, buried beneath later sedimentation, or erased by subsequent environmental changes. Yet in certain coastal and lake regions, geological signatures suggest that extreme wave events have occurred in the deep past. These signatures include unusually thick sand layers deposited far inland, chaotic boulder distributions, and erosion patterns that do not align with normal river or storm activity. In some cases, multiple lines of evidence point to sudden inundation events that exceed the scale of typical seasonal floods by orders of magnitude. For any human populations living near coastlines or large inland water bodies, such events would have been catastrophic, unlike river floods, which may offer some seasonal predictability. These sudden wave-driven inundations arrive without warning on any meaningful human timescale. Survival in such conditions depends almost entirely on chance positioning and rapid escape routes. Archaeological interpretation of these events remains cautious, while geological evidence supports the occurrence of extreme wave activity in various regions. Linking specific deposits to single prehistoric disasters is complex. Time resolution in sediment records is often too coarse to distinguish individual events with precision. As a result, researchers focus on broader patterns rather than isolated catastrophes. Nevertheless, the possibility that such events affected early human populations cannot be dismissed. Coastal and nearshore settlements during periods of lower sea level would have been particularly vulnerable. Many of these sites are now submerged, making direct investigation extremely limited. What is known suggests that human occupation of these zones was both extensive and persistent, increasing the likelihood of exposure to rare but severe inundation events. Inland, similar dynamics can occur in lake systems where landslides or ice collapses generate large displacement waves. These so-called impulse waves can travel across entire basins, overtopping shorelines and flooding adjacent settlements. Geological records from some lake regions show evidence of repeated high-energy wave activity, indicating that such processes may have occurred multiple times over long periods. What makes these events particularly important in the context of human survival is their unpredictability. Unlike seasonal flooding, which allows for the development of adaptive strategies, extreme wave events fall outside the range of expected environmental behavior. They represent a category of risk that cannot be fully integrated into long-term planning. This distinction may help explain why certain flood narratives in later human traditions emphasize suddenness, overwhelming force, and the near-total loss of familiar landscapes. While these narratives cannot be directly tied to specific geological events, they reflect a recurring human experience of abrupt environmental transformation. At the same time, it is important to recognize that such extreme events are rare relative to the broader history of hydrological change. Most flooding experienced by early humans would have been gradual, seasonal, or climatically driven. The catastrophic scenarios represent the upper boundary of environmental variability, not the norm. Still, even rare events can have disproportionate cultural and demographic impact. A single extreme inundation can reshape population distribution, trigger migration, and alter settlement patterns for generations. In this way, rare geological processes can leave lasting imprints on human history far beyond their immediate physical footprint. The archaeological record sometimes hints at these disruptions through sudden breaks in occupation sequences or abrupt changes in material culture. However, interpreting these signals is difficult, as similar patterns can also result from social, economic, or climatic factors unrelated to catastrophic flooding. What emerges from this complexity is a layered understanding of prehistoric risk. Early humans do not face a single type of flood, but a spectrum of hydrological threats ranging from predictable seasonal cycles to rare, high-magnitude disasters. Survival depends on navigating this entire spectrum, often without the ability to distinguish between its different forms in advance. Within this context, resilience is not only about adaptation to known conditions, but also about persistence in the face of the unknown. The ability to recover after sudden disruption becomes as important as the ability to anticipate gradual change. And in the background of this long history of water-driven transformation, the landscape itself carries the memory of these rare events, even when human memory does not. On the margins of rising waters, where coastlines fragment into islands and wetlands, survival takes on a different shape. Here, land is no longer continuous. It is broken into scattered fragments, separated by channels that widen and narrow with tides, storms, and seasonal shifts. In such environments, isolation is not an exception, it is the default condition. During periods of post-glacial sea level rise, many coastal regions that were once broad and interconnected gradually become archipelagos. Low-lying plains are submerged, leaving higher elevations as isolated landmasses. For human populations living in these landscapes, survival increasingly depends on adapting to fragmentation rather than resisting it. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggest that some human groups became isolated in these newly formed island environments for extended periods. These populations often exhibit signs of long-term separation, including distinct cultural material, localized tool traditions, and in some cases, genetic bottlenecks that indicate reduced population size. Isolation, however, is not purely restrictive. In many cases, island environments provide refuge from the most extreme fluctuations of continental systems. While sea levels continue to rise, islands can remain relatively stable ecological niches for certain periods. They offer access to marine resources that become increasingly important as terrestrial ecosystems are reduced or altered. Coastal and island populations likely develop a strong reliance on aquatic food sources, including fish, shellfish, and marine mammals where available. This dietary shift is not merely opportunistic. It reflects a structural adaptation to environments where land-based resources are limited or unpredictable due to flooding and erosion. At the same time, isolation introduces significant challenges. Limited land area restricts population growth. Resource availability can fluctuate dramatically depending on sea conditions and weather patterns, and once sea levels rise beyond a certain threshold, entire populations may be forced to relocate again, often with little warning. One of the most important consequences of this fragmented geography is the emergence of population bottlenecks. When groups become isolated on shrinking landmasses, their numbers can decline sharply. Only a portion of genetic and cultural diversity survives each cycle of environmental stress. Over long periods, this process can significantly shape the structure of human populations. Genetic studies of ancient and modern populations sometimes reveal signatures consistent with such bottlenecks. While these patterns are influenced by many factors, environmental fragmentation during periods of flooding and sea level rise is considered one plausible contributing mechanism. However, interpretations remain cautious, as multiple demographic processes can produce similar genetic signatures. Beyond biology, isolation also affects cultural transmission. When populations are separated by water, exchange of ideas, technologies, and social practices becomes more limited. Over time, this can lead to divergence in cultural traditions, even among groups that originally shared common ancestry. Yet isolation is rarely absolute. Even in fragmented coastal landscapes, water also serves as a connection. Small-scale navigation between islands or across short sea distances allows for intermittent contact. These interactions may be infrequent, but they are enough to maintain broader regional networks of exchange. In this sense, island environments are both separating and connecting systems. They isolate populations physically while still allowing occasional movement across water. The balance between these two forces shapes the long-term evolution of coastal societies. Archaeological evidence from some island regions shows repeated cycles of occupation, abandonment, and reoccupation. These patterns suggest that human presence is closely tied to environmental stability. When conditions are favorable, populations expand and thrive. When sea levels rise or resources decline, groups either relocate or diminish in size. In certain cases, Entire island populations may disappear from the archaeological record for extended periods, only to be replaced later by new groups. Whether these represent continuity, migration, or replacement remains a subject of ongoing research. What is clear is that island environments are highly sensitive to environmental change. The broader implication of this pattern is that rising seas do not only erase land, they restructure human geography. Coastal plains become fragmented. Migration routes shift from land-based corridors to maritime pathways. Population networks reorganize around water rather than around continuous terrain. This transformation has long-term consequences for how human societies develop. The ability to navigate, to cross water, and to maintain connections across fragmented landscapes becomes increasingly important. Skills that may have been marginal in earlier periods become central to survival. At the same time, the memory of lost land remains present in cultural narratives. Even after physical landscapes disappear beneath water, stories of former environments persist. These narratives may preserve echoes of real geographical change, transmitted across generations even after direct experience has faded. What emerges from this combination of archaeological, genetic, and environmental evidence is a picture of human survival shaped by fragmentation and reconnection. Flooding does not simply destroy settlements. It reshapes the entire structure of human distribution across space. And within that reshaped world, survival depends not only on staying above water, but on learning how to exist between islands of stability in a constantly shifting aquatic landscape. In the genetic record carried silently within every human population, there are traces of ancient instability that cannot be seen in stone or sediment alone. DNA preserves a different kind of history, one shaped not by landscapes, but by population size, isolation, and recovery. And within that record, there are signals that suggest humanity has passed through multiple periods of severe demographic contraction. These contractions are not tied to a single cause. Disease, climate change, resource scarcity, and environmental disruption all contribute. But in regions shaped repeatedly by flooding and sea level rise, hydrological instability becomes one of the strongest environmental pressures capable of reducing populations over wide areas in relatively short periods of time. When large coastal zones are submerged or river systems become unstable, human groups are forced into smaller refugia areas where survival remains possible, despite broader environmental collapse. These refuges may be located on higher ground, in inland valleys, or within island systems that remain above rising waters. In each case, the surviving population represents only a fraction of the original diversity. Over time, repeated cycles of expansion and contraction leave detectable signatures in genetic diversity. Some lineages become dominant simply because they were present in the surviving groups. Others disappear entirely, not necessarily because they were less successful, but because they were located in regions most affected by environmental disruption. One of the most widely discussed patterns in human genetics is the evidence of past population bottlenecks, where the total number of breeding individuals appears to have been drastically reduced for a period before expanding again. While the causes of these bottlenecks are still debated, environmental factors including climate shifts and resource instability are considered important contributors. Flood-related environmental change offers a plausible mechanism for such reductions, especially when combined with other stressors. Rising sea levels can eliminate entire coastal populations. Extreme flooding events can disrupt river-valley societies. Fragmentation of habitats can isolate groups, making them more vulnerable to local extinction. When combined, these processes can significantly reduce population size across broad regions. Yet genetic evidence also reveals something equally important: recovery. After periods of contraction, human populations expand again, often rapidly in evolutionary terms. This suggests not only survival, but a strong capacity for regeneration once environmental conditions stabilize or new territories become available. In this way, the genetic record reflects a long rhythm of loss and renewal. It does not show a straight line of growth, but a series of dips and recoveries, shaped by environmental pressures that periodically compress and then release population structure. Archaeology complements this picture by showing how cultural traditions also persist through disruption. Even when settlements disappear from a region, similar technologies or symbolic practices can reappear later, sometimes in nearby areas. This continuity suggests that knowledge is not always lost, even when populations are displaced. However, linking genetic patterns directly to specific flood events remains difficult. The timescales involved are often too broad, and multiple overlapping processes can produce similar signals. A population bottleneck identified in genetic data may reflect a combination of flooding, drought, disease, and migration rather than a single catastrophic cause. Still, when viewed alongside geological and archaeological evidence, the possibility that hydrological instability contributed to some of these demographic shifts becomes difficult to ignore. In regions where rising seas and extreme flooding coincide with evidence of settlement disruption, the alignment of multiple data sources strengthens the interpretation of environmental impact. One of the most important insights from this convergence of evidence is that human survival during these periods is not simply about avoiding disaster, but about maintaining continuity through it. Even when populations are reduced, they are not erased. They persist in smaller, more fragmented forms, carrying forward cultural and biological inheritance into new environments. This persistence depends on flexibility. Groups that can move, adapt subsistence strategies, and reorganize social structures are more likely to survive periods of environmental stress. Those that are fixed in place or heavily dependent on stable conditions are more vulnerable to disruption. Flooding, in this context, acts as a selective force not in a deterministic sense, but as a repeated environmental pressure that shapes which populations remain connected and which become isolated or lost. Over long timescales, this contributes to the uneven distribution of genetic and cultural diversity observed in later human history. Yet despite these cycles of contraction, there is no indication of permanent collapse. At every stage, human populations recover, expand, and eventually reoccupy landscapes that were once abandoned or submerged. The continuity of humanity is not defined by uninterrupted growth, but by repeated recovery from disruption. And within that deeper pattern lies one of the most important truths of ancient survival. Even when water removes entire landscapes from the map, it does not erase the capacity for life to return. When water repeatedly reshapes the ground beneath human settlement, survival begins to depend on more than reaction. It requires anticipation. Over time, early societies develop increasingly sophisticated ways of reading environmental signals, not as isolated events, but as patterns that suggest what might come next. These patterns are subtle. A shift in river clarity can indicate upstream erosion. Changes in sediment composition can suggest increased rainfall or glacial melt. Altered animal migration routes can reflect habitat disruption caused by flooding elsewhere. None of these signs alone guarantees prediction, but together they form a mosaic of environmental awareness that becomes essential for long-term survival. In riverine and coastal environments, this kind of environmental literacy becomes deeply embedded in daily life. Communities learn to observe water levels, seasonal timing, and landscape changes with a level of attention that modern observers might underestimate. Survival depends on noticing small deviations before they become large disruptions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some early settlement planning reflects this accumulated knowledge. Sites are often positioned with careful consideration of elevation, drainage patterns, and proximity to flood zones. In some cases, settlement layouts appear to incorporate deliberate spacing or tiered construction, possibly as a response to recurring water events. This does not mean that early humans can predict floods in a modern scientific sense. Rather, they operate within a framework of experience-based forecasting, where memory of past events guides present decisions. If a particular valley floods every few generations, that memory influences where and how future settlements are built. Over long periods, this experiential knowledge may evolve into more formalized systems of environmental interpretation. Seasonal calendars, oral traditions, and ritual practices often encode observations about water behavior. While these systems are not scientific in the modern sense, they reflect sustained engagement with environmental variability. At the same time, not all flooding is predictable. Extreme events, especially those driven by rare geological or climatic triggers, fall outside the range of accumulated experience. These are the events that disrupt even well-adapted systems, reminding human populations that knowledge has limits. The tension between predictability and unpredictability becomes a defining feature of human relationship with water. On one hand, there is increasing ability to anticipate seasonal patterns and moderate floods. On the other, there remains the constant possibility of rare, high-magnitude events that exceed all prior experience. This duality shapes not only survival strategies but also cultural interpretations of water. In many traditions, water is associated with both order and chaos, renewal and destruction. These symbolic meanings may reflect the lived experience of environments where stability is always conditional. In practical terms, anticipation leads to behavioral adaptation. Communities may shift settlement locations seasonally, store resources in anticipation of floods, or develop mobility strategies that allow rapid relocation. These practices reduce vulnerability but do not eliminate risk. One of the most important developments in this context is the increasing integration of water management into early infrastructure. Even simple modifications such as raised platforms, drainage channels, or modified riverbanks represent attempts to influence water behavior rather than simply endure it. While these systems are limited in scale, they mark an important shift in human-environment interaction. Yet despite these adaptations, the archaeological record continues to show repeated disruption. Flood layers, abandoned settlements, and relocated habitation zones indicate that even well-prepared communities remain vulnerable to environmental extremes. Anticipation reduces impact, but it cannot fully prevent it. Over time, this ongoing cycle of prediction and disruption reinforces a worldview in which uncertainty is permanent. Rather than expecting stability, early societies appear to develop frameworks that assume variability as the norm. Survival becomes less about achieving control and more about maintaining flexibility. In some regions, this flexibility extends to social organization itself. Networks of related groups may span multiple ecological zones, allowing populations to shift between areas depending on environmental conditions. This distributed structure increases resilience by avoiding overdependence on any single landscape. The broader implication is that early human survival is not anchored in static settlement, but in dynamic movement across changing environments. Water, in this sense, is not only a force that must be anticipated, but also a signal that guides mobility and adaptation. And within that continuous process of reading, responding and adjusting, human societies begin to develop a deeper understanding the world does not offer certainty, only patterns that can be learned, interpreted and acted upon before they change again. By the time human societies begin forming larger and more interconnected cultural systems, the memory of flooding is no longer confined to direct experience. It becomes embedded in inherited tradition, shaping how communities understand their origins, their vulnerabilities, and their place within a changing world. Across distant regions, narratives describing great waters that reshape the land continue to appear in later oral and written traditions. While these accounts differ in detail, they often share a structural core, a world in which water rises beyond normal limits, forcing survival through adaptation, relocation, or selective preservation of life. These stories are not uniform records of a single event, but they may reflect a long accumulation of environmental experiences transmitted through cultural memory. What is particularly significant is the persistence of these narratives even in societies that later become technologically and socially complex. The memory of water-driven destruction does not disappear with the rise of agriculture or urbanization. Instead, it is often reinterpreted, integrated into cosmology, or used to explain the boundaries between past and present worlds. At the same time, geological and archaeological evidence continues to show that flooding remains a real and recurring environmental force during the formative stages of these societies. Early cities and agricultural centers are frequently located in regions where water systems are both essential and unstable. Rivers continue to shift, coastal zones remain vulnerable, and extreme events occasionally disrupt established settlement patterns. This overlap between lived experience and inherited memory creates a layered understanding of water. For some communities, floods are remembered as historical events. For others, they become symbolic representations of transformation, moral order, or cycles of destruction and renewal. In both cases, water retains its role as a boundary-defining force. One of the most important developments during this period is the increasing ability of human societies to organize around large-scale water management. Irrigation systems, drainage networks, and early forms of hydraulic engineering begin to emerge in several regions. These systems represent attempts not only to respond to flooding, but to regulate and harness water for agricultural and urban stability. However, even as control increases, vulnerability does not disappear. Large-scale water systems introduce new forms of risk, including structural failure, mismanagement, and dependency on stable environmental conditions. A breakdown in these systems can have consequences as severe as the natural floods they are designed to mitigate. Archaeological evidence from early urban centers shows that some societies experience repeated cycles of growth and disruption, linked to water availability and flood control. Periods of expansion are often followed by phases of decline when environmental conditions shift or infrastructure becomes insufficient to manage extreme variability. This pattern reinforces the long-standing relationship between human development and hydrological instability. Even as technology advances, water remains a central force shaping settlement sustainability. It is both a resource that enables growth and a risk that can undermine it. In parallel, cultural expressions of water continue to evolve. Flood narratives are integrated into religious frameworks, cosmological systems, and symbolic representations of order and chaos. While these interpretations vary widely, they often reflect an underlying awareness of water's capacity to redefine the boundaries of human existence. What emerges from this long historical trajectory is a continuity of experience that spans from prehistory into recorded civilization. The same environmental forces that shaped early survival continue to influence later societies, even as their interpretations become more abstract or symbolic. At the deepest level, the relationship between humans and flooding is not defined by a single moment of origin, but by repetition. Rising waters, shifting rivers, and unstable coastlines appear again and again across time, shaping both physical landscapes and cultural memory. And as human societies grow more complex, they do not move beyond this relationship. Instead, they carry it forward, embedding it into stories, infrastructure, and collective understanding of the natural world. In this way, the memory of ancient floods is not a relic of the past. It is a continuous thread running through human history, connecting the earlier survival strategies to the foundations of a later civilization. Water leaves no permanent boundary that it does not eventually challenge. Even the largest rivers, the most carefully managed floodplains, and the most advanced early hydraulic systems exist within limits defined not by human intention, but by the behavior of climate, geology, and time itself. In the long arc of prehistory, this reality repeats so often that it becomes less an exception and more a fundamental condition of existence. By the later stages of early civilization, human societies have developed increasingly complex ways of living with water. Cities rise along rivers, irrigation networks expand across plains, and coastal settlements grow into centers of trade and cultural exchange. Yet beneath this apparent stability, the same hydrological forces that shaped earlier survival continue to operate, sometimes quietly, sometimes with sudden force. Archaeological records from early urban regions reveal a recurring pattern. Periods of prosperity often coincide with stable water systems, predictable flooding cycles, and reliable agricultural output. But these periods are rarely permanent. Changes in river behavior, shifts in monsoon intensity, or long-term climatic fluctuations can disrupt the balance on which these societies depend. When such disruptions occur, the impact is rarely isolated. Flooding can damage agricultural fields, alter trade routes, and undermine infrastructure that took generations to build. In some cases, entire urban centers are abandoned or significantly reduced in scale, leaving behind layers of occupation that mark both achievement and collapse. Yet even in the aftermath of disruption, human presence does not vanish. Populations reorganize, relocate, and rebuild in new configurations. The memory of previous floods often influences these decisions, guiding the selection of safer elevations, alternative river branches, or more stable coastal zones. Survival is not a return to a previous state, but a continuous adjustment informed by accumulated experience. Over time, this cycle of construction, disruption, and reconstruction becomes a defining rhythm of human history. Water is not a background element in this process. It is a central force that repeatedly resets the conditions under which societies develop. Even as technological and organizational complexity increases, the underlying dependence on stable hydrological systems remains unchanged. In more recent layers of the archaeological and historical record, there is also evidence of increasing attempts to formalize control over water. Large-scale irrigation systems, flood barriers, and drainage networks represent some of the earliest expressions of engineered environmental management. These systems reflect both growing confidence in human ability to shape nature and continued awareness of water's potential to exceed control. However, engineering does not eliminate vulnerability. In some cases, it concentrates risk. When water systems fail, the consequences can extend across entire regions, affecting multiple interconnected settlements simultaneously. The same networks that enable agricultural expansion can also transmit disruption when environmental conditions shift beyond expected ranges. This paradox underscores a deeper continuity that runs through the entire history of human interaction with flooding. Control and vulnerability are not opposites, they coexist. The more societies adapt to water, the more their survival becomes intertwined with its behavior. Looking back across the full span of this long history, from the earliest post-glacial landscapes to the formation of complex civilizations, a consistent pattern emerges. Human survival is repeatedly shaped by cycles of inundation and retreat, stability and disruption, expansion and contraction. These cycles do not follow a single predictable rhythm, but they recur often enough to define the conditions under which adaptation evolves. In this context, the story of ancient floods is not simply a record of disasters, it is a record of persistence. Populations are displaced but not erased. Landscapes are transformed but not abandoned permanently. Knowledge is lost in some places but reappears in others. Across generations, the thread of continuity is maintained through movement, memory, and reconstruction. Even today, the legacy of this long relationship with water remains visible. Modern societies continue to concentrate in river valleys and coastal zones, regions that offer productivity and connectivity, but also carry inherent hydrological risk. The same tension that shaped early survival continues to shape settlement, infrastructure, and planning in the present. The deeper implication is that flooding is not a historical anomaly, but a structural feature of human existence in dynamic planetary systems. Water does not simply interrupt human history, it helps define its boundaries, its rhythms, and its capacity for renewal. And as the narrative of ancient survival comes into focus, what remains most striking is not the scale of destruction, but the continuity that follows it. Again and again, landscapes change, waters rise, and boundaries shift. And again, human presence returns reorganized, adapted, and reattached to a world that never stops moving. In the end, the story of ancient floods is not only a story about water rising over land, it is a story about time itself reshaping the conditions of survival. Landscapes that once seemed permanent slowly dissolve into memory, while new environments emerge from retreating waters. What remains constant is not the ground, but the movement. Across thousands of years, humans do not stand apart from this transformation. They move within it. They follow rivers that change course, coastlines that shift outward and inward, and climates that expand and contract without warning. In doing so, they carry forward a kind of continuity that is not tied to any single place, but to the ability to adapt when place itself becomes uncertain. The traces left behind buried settlements, submerged landscapes, scattered artifacts are fragments of a much larger pattern. They suggest that survival was never about avoiding disruption, but about remaining present through it. Even when entire regions were lost beneath water, life did not end. It moved, reformed, and continued elsewhere. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded across this long history. Water does not only erase, it also redistributes. It clears space, reshapes boundaries, and forces new forms of connection between people and the environments they inhabit. Seen from this perspective, ancient floods are not distant catastrophes belonging to a forgotten world. They are part of a continuous relationship between humans and a planet that never remains still for long. The same forces that once reshaped prehistoric landscapes still operate today, only now within a more complex web of societies, technologies, and memories. What endures is not stability, but adaptation, not permanence, but return. And in that return across countless generations, across changing worlds, the story of survival continues quietly, beneath the surface of everything that appears fixed,